For 5 years, she was his shadow, his strategist, and the only person who knew exactly how he took his coffee, and how he disposed of his enemies. But to Kang Ji-hoon, the coldest chairman in Seoul's underworld, she was just a permanent fixture. A tool that didn't need praise. Until the morning she placed a cream-colored envelope on his mahogany desk. "I'm resigning, Chairman," she said, her voice steadier than his pulse had ever been. "I've accepted a marriage proposal." Ji-hoon didn't even look up from his ledger. "Fine. Send the HR file for your replacement. You might want to check the groom's name first," she whispered. He finally looked up. The name on the invitation wasn't just a man, it was the only man Ji-hoon had spent a decade trying to destroy. In the high-stakes world of Seoul's corporate syndicates, loyalty is a currency and silence is a survival skill. Min Ah-young was the gold standard of both. As the executive assistant to the ruthless head of the Kong syndicate, she survived drive-bys, hostile takeovers, and Ji-hoon's icy indifference with effortless grace. She wasn't just his employee, she was the architect of his empire. But after half a decade of being treated like a ghost, Ah-young is tired of waiting for a man who treats a billion-dollar merger with more passion than her presence. She isn't just quitting, she's switching sides. By choosing to marry Shin Tae-oh, the charismatic and lethal rival who has been hunting Ji-hoon for years, Ah-young has just started the most dangerous war Korea has ever seen. Now, the man who never spared her a glance is realizing that without her, his empire is crumbling, and his heart is finally beating for the first time, fueled by a toxic mix of regret and pure, unadulterated rage. "You ignored me when I was yours," she told him as his rival's ring caught the light. "Don't start noticing me now that I'm his." The penthouse office of the Kong Syndicate headquarters was a testament to its master, vast, immaculate, and freezing. Min Ah-young walked across the polished marble floor, her footsteps silent in her designer heels. In her left hand, she carried a tray holding a cup of black coffee, exactly 180 degrees Celsius, brewed from beans imported through a cartel they had acquired last Tuesday. In her right hand, she held a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with gold wax. Behind the massive mahogany desk sat Kang Ji-hoon. He was reviewing a ledger, his sharp jawline clenched, dark hair falling slightly over eyes that held the warmth of a loaded gun. "Chairman," Ah-young said, her voice perfectly modulated. She set the coffee down inches from his left hand. "The harbor acquisition is complete. The director of the union tried to dispute the terms, but I reminded him of his gambling debts in Macau." He signed. Ji-hoon didn't look up. His pen continued to scratch across the paper. "And the leak in the accounting department?" "Dealt with," she replied smoothly. "He won't be returning to Seoul. Ever." "Good." It was a single, flat syllable. Not a compliment, just an acknowledgement of a machine working as intended. For 5 years, this had been their dynamic. Ah-young bled for him, lied for him, and paved his path to the throne of Seoul's underworld with her own 2 hands. And for 5 years, he had treated her like the mahogany desk he sat at, expensive, useful, and entirely invisible. Today, however, the machine was unplugging itself. Ah-young took a slow breath, letting the icy air of the office fill her lungs one last time. She placed the cream-colored envelope directly on top of the ledger, right over the numbers he was reading. Ji-hoon's pen stopped. He stared at the envelope, his brows furrowing in mild irritation. He still didn't look up at her. "What is this?" "If it's the gala invitation from the mayor, tell him I'm busy." "It's not from the mayor, Chairman," Ah-young said. Her voice was steadier than her pulse. "It's from me." He paused, finally leaning back in his leather chair. His dark eyes flicked up to meet hers, registering her presence for the first time that morning. "A raise? You know I don't read these. Just tell finance to add another 0 to your bonus." "I'm resigning, Chairman." Silence fell over the room, heavy and absolute. The only sound was the faint hum of the city traffic 50 stories below. Ji-hoon stared at her. His expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed imperceptibly. He reached for his coffee, taking a slow sip. Did a rival syndicate offer you a better salary? Name the number. I'll double it. It's not about money. Ah-young stood perfectly straight, her hands clasped in front of her. I've accepted a marriage proposal. Ji-hoon placed the cup back on the saucer with a soft clink. The irritation in his eyes faded back into his signature, chilling indifference. Fine, he dismissed, picking up his pen again. Send the HR file for your replacement by noon. You can take a week off for your honeymoon, but I expect you back for the quarter-end review. You misunderstand me, Ji-hoon, she said, dropping his formal title for the first time in half a decade. I am leaving. Permanently. A 2-week notice is standard courtesy, but considering my future husband's line of work, leaving immediately is a matter of syndicate security. That made him stop. The pen hovered over the ledger. He looked at the cream-colored envelope again. It wasn't a resignation letter. It was a wedding invitation. You're marrying someone in life, Ji-hoon stated, his voice dropping an octave, a dangerous edge creeping into his tone. Who? You might want to check the groom's name for yourself, she whispered. With a swift, annoyed motion, Ji-hoon broke the gold wax seal and pulled out the heavy cardstock. His eyes scanned the elegant cursive font, expecting the name of some mid-level lieutenant from a subservient gang. Instead, he read the name printed boldly in gold ink next to hers. Shin Tae-oh. The air in the room seemed to shatter. Tae-oh. The head of the Shin cartel. The man who had put a bullet in Ji-hoon's shoulder 3 years ago. The charismatic, laughing devil who had been systematically trying to dismantle the Kong Empire piece by piece. His greatest rival. His mortal enemy. Ji-hoon's breathing stopped. His eyes darted from the gold ink to Ah-young, the woman who knew every security code, every bank account, every weak point in his entire organization. You. Ji-hoon started, his voice suddenly hollow. My desk has been cleared, Ah-young said, turning on her heel. Goodbye, Chairman. As she walked toward the heavy double doors, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. Just as her hand touched the brass handle, she heard the deafening crash of Ji-hoon's coffee cup violently shattering against the marble wall behind her, followed by the sound of his desk being violently overturned. The silence was finally broken. And the war had just begun. The air in Shin Tae-oh's sprawling penthouse felt alive, vibrating with the low thrum of a jazz record and the scent of expensive cigar smoke. Unlike the sterile, freezing mausoleum of Kang Ji-hoon's office, Tae-oh's sanctum was a riot of warmth, rich velvet, dim amber lighting, and the chaotic energy of a man who actually enjoyed his power. Min Ah-young stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the neon-drenched Seoul skyline. She wore a sleek, silver slip dress that clung to her frame, a stark departure from the severe, armored suit she had worn for 5 years. I heard a rumor, a voice purred from the shadows. Tae-oh stepped into the light, holding 2 crystal glasses of amber liquid. He was a devastatingly handsome man, with a lazy, predatory smile that rarely reached his calculating eyes. He wore a silk shirt unbuttoned at the collar, completely devoid of the rigid formality Ji-hoon wore like a second skin. They say Kang Ji-hoon threw a 200-pound mahogany desk across his office this morning, Tae-oh continued, handing her a glass. His fingers lightly brushed hers, lingering for a fraction of a second. I would have paid a fortune to see the look on that arrogant bastard's face. Ah-young took a sip, the whiskey burning a pleasant trail down her throat. He was surprised. That's all. Surprised. Tae-oh laughed, a rich, dark sound. He leaned against the glass beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. Ah-young, you didn't just surprise him. You gutted him. You were the only thing keeping that frozen empire running. Without you, he's bleeding out, and he doesn't even know how to tie a tourniquet. He wasn't entirely wrong. Across the city, the Kong syndicate was unraveling. In her first 24 hours absent, 3 international shipments had stalled at the harbor because no one else knew the encrypted customs bypass codes. The accounting department was in a panic, and Ji-hoon's top lieutenants were terrified to approach a boss who had spent the entire night locked in his destroyed office, drinking in the dark. "Let's not pretend this is purely for my benefit, Teo," she said, turning to face him. Her gaze was unflinching. "This marriage is a strategic alliance. You get the ultimate psychological weapon against your greatest rival, and you gain access to the vulnerabilities in his network. I get half of the Shin cartel's legitimate holdings and a permanent seat at the table. We stick to the terms." Teo's smile softened, but his eyes grew infinitely more intense. He reached out, gently tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Of course, my beautiful strategist," he murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But don't insult me by thinking I only want his secrets. I've spent 5 years watching him ignore the most magnificent creature in Seoul. The empire is just a bonus. You are the prize." The grand ballroom of the Paradise Hotel was a sea of silk, diamonds, and dangerous men hiding behind polite smiles. It was the official engagement gala of Shin Tae-oh and Min Ah-young, an event that had sent shockwaves through the criminal and corporate elite of South Korea. Ah-young stood at the center of it all, a vision in a sweeping crimson evening gown that left her bare-shouldered. She was laughing, a genuine, musical sound, at something Tae-oh had whispered in her ear. His arm was wrapped possessively around her waist, claiming her in front of every cartel boss and corrupt politician in the city. Then, the temperature in the room plummeted. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open with a deafening thud. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The low hum of conversation died instantly, replaced by the collective holding of breath. Kang Ji-hoon stood in the doorway. He wore a bespoke, pitch-black tuxedo that looked less like a celebration and more like a funeral shroud. Behind him stood 6 of his deadliest enforcers, their hands resting ominously inside their jackets. But it was Ji-hoon who commanded the terror in the room. His eyes, devoid of any light, scanned the crowd until they locked onto the flash of crimson silk. Ah-young's breath hitched. She had expected retaliation, but not this. Ji-hoon never left his fortress for social events. He despised them. Yet here he was, radiating a lethal, unrestrained fury that made the surrounding guests instinctively step back, creating a clear path between him and the engaged couple. Taeo's lazy smile didn't falter, though his grip on Ah-young's waist tightened. "Well," he murmured. "Look who finally decided to come out of his cave." Ji-hoon walked slowly across the polished floor, his gaze never leaving Ah-young. He didn't look at her like an employee who had breached a contract. He looked at her like a starving man staring at a feast he had foolishly thrown away. When his eyes swept over her bare shoulders and the crimson dress, a muscle feathered in his tight jaw. He stopped 3 feet away. "Shin," Ji-hoon said, his voice a low, gravelly threat that barely carried over the silence. "I see you're still picking up things that don't belong to you. And I see you're still blind to what's right in front of you, Kang," Tae-oh countered smoothly, taking a sip of his champagne. "Or, at least, what used to be in front of you. She's mine now. You received the invitation, didn't you?" Ji-hoon ignored him entirely. He stepped closer to Ah-young, invading her personal space, his scent of bergamot and cold rain washing over her. The raw intensity in his eyes was something she had never seen in 5 years. "Take off that ridiculous dress," Ji-hoon ordered, his voice vibrating with a dark, possessive command. "And get in the car, Ah-young. We're leaving." Ah-young tilted her chin up, meeting his furious gaze with absolute ice. "I don't take orders from you anymore, Kang Ji-hoon. Now, get out of my party before my fiancé has you thrown out. Within a week of the gala, the Cold War turned entirely hot. The streets of Seoul whispered with the chaotic fallout of Ah Young's departure. The Kong Syndicate, once an impenetrable fortress of calculated moves, was suddenly bleeding territory. It started with the harbor docks. Ji-hoon's men had arrived for a midnight transit of untraceable microchips, only to find Taeo's cartel already loading the crates onto their own trucks. 2 days later, a high-stakes real estate buyout in Gangnam was snatched out from under Ji-hoon's nose because Taeo had magically known their maximum bidding ceiling. The council of the Kong Syndicate sat in the freezing boardroom, terrified. "She's leaking our intel," one of the older capos spat, slamming his fist on the table. "Min Ah-young built our encryption networks. She knows our blind spots. Chairman, you must give the order. We have to eliminate her before she hands the entire city to Shin Tae-oh." At the head of the table, Ji-hoon sat in suffocating silence. He stared at the empty chair to his right, her chair. The urge to commit violence was a living, breathing thing inside his chest. But the thought of ordering a hit on Ah-young made his blood run cold in a way that had nothing to do with his ruthless reputation. "No one touches her," Ji-hoon finally spoke, his voice dangerously quiet. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "If anyone so much as looks at her with a loaded weapon, I will personally skin them alive. Is that understood?" The capo swallowed hard, nodding rapidly. Instead of sending assassins, Ji-hoon had deployed his elite shadows. Their orders were simple: watch her. Every night, his desk was flooded with surveillance photos. Ah-young at a cafe. Ah-young reviewing blueprints with Tae-oh. Ah-young laughing. It was a masochistic ritual. Ji-hoon spent hours staring at the glossy prints, tracing the lines of her smile, a smile he had never bothered to notice when she was his. The obsession was gnawing at his sanity, replacing his hunger for power with a desperate, feral need to reclaim what he had lost. By Friday, the tension snapped. One of Taeo's top lieutenants was foolish enough to gloat at an underground casino, boasting about how the Ice Queen had handed them Kang's kingdom on a silver platter. Ji-hoon didn't send his men. He went himself. In the damp, flickering light of the casino's back alley, Ji-hoon stood over the beaten, bloodied lieutenant. He casually wiped his brass knuckles with a silk handkerchief, his eyes dead and unfeeling as the man groaned on the asphalt. "Deliver a message to your boss," Ji-hoon said, dropping the blood-stained handkerchief onto the man's chest. "Tell Shin Tae-oh to enjoy the stolen shipments and the real estate. Let him have the harbor. But tell him if he touches my woman again, I will burn his entire cartel to the ground just to keep her warm." The monsoon rains hit Seoul with a vengeance, turning the neon-lit streets into blurred streaks of color. Ah-young was driving her sleek black sedan through the winding roads of the upscale Pyeongchang-dong district, relishing the rare moment of solitude. Being engaged to Tae-oh was exhilarating, but his constant, overwhelming attention was exhausting after years of operating in Ji-hoon's shadow. She tapped her fingers against the steering wheel to the rhythm of the rain, her mind drifting to the chaotic engagement gala. The look in Ji-hoon's eyes, feral, broken, and desperate, had haunted her for a week. Suddenly, blinding high beams flashed in her rearview mirror. Before she could react, a massive, armored SUV swerved violently in front of her, forcing her to slam on the brakes. The tires screeched against the slick asphalt as her car skidded to a halt, inches away from the SUV's bumper. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She reached for the silver pistol strapped to her thigh, her training kicking in instantly. But the man who stepped out of the SUV wasn't an assassin. Kang Ji-hoon walked through the torrential downpour without an umbrella. His tailored suit was instantly soaked, clinging to his broad shoulders, his dark hair plastered against his forehead. He marched directly to her driver's side door and yanked it open with terrifying strength. "Get out," he demanded, his voice slicing through the sound of the rain. Ah Young kept her hand hovering near her weapon, glaring up at him. Are you insane? You could have killed me, Ji-hoon. Get out. She stepped out into the pouring rain, refusing to be intimidated. She stood toe-to-toe with him, the cold rain instantly soaking her silk blouse. What is your problem? You ambushed me like a street thug. My problem. Ji-hoon suddenly closed the distance between them, trapping her against the side of her car. His hands slammed against the roof, caging her in. Water dripped from his eyelashes, but his gaze was a burning inferno. My problem is that my entire empire is falling apart, and the only thing I can think about is another man touching you. Ah Young froze. The admission was violently raw, tearing away the impenetrable ice he had worn for 5 years. You have no right to say that, she pushed hard against his chest, but he didn't budge an inch. You ignored me for 5 years. To you, I was just a piece of furniture that occasionally handed you a loaded gun. You want to know why I chose him? Because when I walk into a room, Teo actually looks at me. I was looking. Ji-hoon roared, the restraint finally snapping. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip desperate. I never stopped looking, Ah Young. I ignored you because if I had let myself touch you even once, I would have burned my own syndicate to the ground just to keep you. You were the only weakness I couldn't afford. He looked down at her lips, his chest heaving as the rain washed over them both. And now I'm burning it down anyway. The neutral ground was a high-end, violently expensive private dining room in a restaurant overlooking the Han River. Shin Teo sat at one end of the long mahogany table, swirling a glass of scotch. At the other end sat Kang Ji-hoon, his posture rigidly straight, exuding a cold, murderous intent that made the heavily armed guards by the doors sweat. Let's skip the pleasantries, Kang, Teo began, his signature lazy smile firmly in place. You're bleeding. Without your architect, your supply lines are tangled, your men are paranoid, and your accounts are exposed. I could crush you in a month. Try it, Ji-hoon replied softly, his voice a blade wrapped in silk. I'll bury you in the rubble. Teo chuckled, leaning forward. But I don't want a war that destroys the city. I'm a businessman. So, I'm offering you a trade. You officially concede the Western Harbor territory, hand over the logistics networks, and step down from the Syndicate Council. In exchange, I will call off the wedding. Ji-hoon's jaw locked. The harbor was the crown jewel of the Kong Syndicate, the very artery that pumped wealth into his empire. Giving it up meant crippling his legacy forever. But the alternative was watching Min Ah-young walk down the aisle and swear her life to his enemy. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, the image of her in the rain burning in his mind. Draft the paperwork, Ji-hoon said, the words tasting like ash. Before Teo could smile in triumph, the double doors of the dining room were kicked open. Ah-young strode in, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She looked between the two men, her eyes flashing with a terrifying, unbridled fury. She slammed a thick file onto the center of the table. Did you really think, she hissed, glaring at them both, that you could sit in a room and trade me like a shipment of stolen weapons? Teo's smile vanished. Ah-young, this is syndicate business. I am the business, she snapped, cutting him off. She pointed to the file. While you two were measuring egos, I had a meeting with the Russian Bratva. I just handed them the shipping routes for both the Western Harbor and Teo's northern supply lines. If either of you tries to move the product without my explicit authorization, the Russians will sink your fleets. Ji-hoon stared at her, utterly stunned. She had just checkmated the two most powerful men in Seoul in a single afternoon. I am not a prize to be won, and I am not collateral, Ah-young stated, her voice echoing in the silent room. She looked directly at Ji-hoon, her gaze turning to ice. The wedding is happening. And if you ever try to buy me again, Ji-hoon, I will make sure you have nothing left to pay with. The bridal boutique in Cheongdam-dong was a fortress of white tulle, sparkling chandeliers, and exclusivity. At 2 a.m., it was entirely deserted, save for the solitary figure standing on the velvet pedestal in the center of the main showroom. Ah-young stared at her reflection in the towering trifold mirrors. The wedding gown was a masterpiece of intricate lace and imported silk, hugging her curves before cascading into a dramatic train. It was flawless. It was everything a bride could dream of. And yet, looking at herself in the glass, all she felt was a suffocating, hollow ache. The soft click of the boutique's security lock disengaging echoed through the quiet room. Ah-young didn't flinch. She simply watched in the mirror as a tall shadow detached itself from the darkness near the entrance. Kang Ji-hoon stepped into the soft, ambient light of the showroom. He looked wrecked. His tie was gone, his collar was unbuttoned, and the permanent mask of untouchable arrogance had completely shattered. He stopped a few feet behind her, his dark eyes tracing the silhouette of the white dress in the mirror. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, loaded with 5 years of unspoken words and missed chances. "It's secure," Ji-hoon finally said, his voice raspy, barely more than a whisper. "Your brava deal. It was brilliant. You outmaneuvered us both flawlessly." "I learned from the best," she replied coldly, not turning around. Ji-hoon closed the distance between them. He stopped just inches behind her back, his presence a heavy, electric heat against the chill of the silk dress. He didn't touch her, but Ah-young could see his hands trembling slightly in the mirror's reflection. "Take it off," he pleaded. It wasn't an order this time. It was a desperate, broken prayer. "Ji-hoon. Please." The word tore out of his throat. Slowly, the ruthless chairman of the Kong Syndicate, the man who bowed to no one and feared nothing, dropped to his knees behind her. His head bowed, resting lightly against the sweeping train of her gown. Ah-young's breath hitched, her heart violently hammering against her ribs. She looked down at him, the sight of his utter submission breaking the last of her defenses. "I was a fool," Ji-hoon whispered to the floor, his voice thick with raw emotion. "I built an empire thinking it would keep me warm, and I froze the only person who actually cared about me. I don't care about the harbor. I don't care about the syndicate. I will burn it all down and hand the ashes to Teo if it means you don't marry him." He slowly looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers in the mirror, entirely stripped of his pride. "I love you, Ah-young. I have loved you since the day you walked into my office. Don't do this. Don't belong to him." The Shin cartel's private estate was heavily fortified, crawling with armed guards disguised as valets and ushers. The sprawling outdoor garden had been transformed into a lavish wedding venue, draped in white roses and flooded with the golden light of the late afternoon sun. Ah-young stood at the altar, the lace of her veil casting delicate shadows over her face. Shin Tae-oh held her hands, looking devastatingly handsome in his white tuxedo. He smiled, but there was a sharp, calculating edge to his eyes. He knew exactly what he was stealing, and he was savoring the victory. The officiant cleared his throat, adjusting his microphone. "If anyone here has a reason why these two should not be joined in matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace." The response was not a voice. It was the deafening explosion of the estate's main security gates being blown off their hinges. Screams erupted from the crowd as heavily armed men clad in black tactical gear flooded the immaculate lawns. The string quartet dove behind their cellos. Champagne flutes shattered as gunfire erupted into the air, a warning shot that echoed like thunder across the manicured gardens. Through the parting sea of panicked guests and scrambling cartel guards, Kang Ji-hoon walked forward. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He wore a midnight black trench coat, a suppressed tactical pistol resting casually in his right hand. His eyes were locked onto the altar, burning with the intensity of a dying star. Behind him, 50 of his deadliest enforcers formed an impenetrable wall, their weapons raised, freezing Tao's men in their tracks. "I object," Ji-hoon stated clearly, his voice carrying over the chaos. Tao shoved Ah-young behind him, smoothly drawing a gold-plated firearm from inside his jacket and aiming it directly at Ji-hoon's chest. The lazy smile was gone, replaced by pure, murderous rage. "You're a dead man, Kong," Tao snarled. "You walked into a slaughterhouse." Ji-hoon didn't even look at Tao's weapon. He kept walking, ignoring the red laser dot that settled over his heart. He stopped at the base of the altar stairs, his gaze fixed entirely on the woman in the white dress. "You gave me an ultimatum," Ji-hoon said to Ah-young, completely ignoring the guns pointed at his head. "You told me you weren't collateral. You told me you were the business. So, I'm not here to buy you from him. I'm here to submit my syndicate to you." Tao laughed darkly. "You're insane." Ji-hoon finally glanced at Tao, his expression turning lethal. "Pull the trigger, Shin. My men have orders to wipe your entire bloodline off the map the second I hit the ground. Or, you can put the gun down, and walk away with your life." The standoff was suffocating. Dozens of weapons clicked, ready to fire. The fate of Seoul's underworld hung by a single, fraying thread. Everything paused, waiting for the final Mafia verdict. "Enough." Ah-young's voice rang out, sharp and absolute. She stepped out from behind Tao, placing her hand firmly over the barrel of his gold-plated gun, forcing it downward. The silence in the garden was heavier than the gunfire had been. Tao stared at Ah-young, betrayal flashing across his features as she pushed his weapon away. "Ah-young," Tao warned, his voice dangerously low. "Don't." She looked at him, her expression softening just a fraction, acknowledging the genuine alliance they had almost built. "I told you, Tao. I want a partner who sees me. But I also want the man who finally learned how to surrender." She turned away from the altar, leaving Tao standing alone amidst the white roses. She descended the stairs, her heavy silk train dragging across the grass, until she stood face to face with Ji-hoon. He was breathing heavily, his eyes frantically searching hers for a definitive answer. "You said you're submitting the syndicate to me," Ah-young said, her tone all business, though her eyes betrayed a flickering warmth. "I want 50% of all legitimate and illegitimate holdings. I want my seat permanently installed at the head of the council table. And I want the harbor." Ji-hoon didn't hesitate for a microsecond. "Done." Furthermore, she continued, stepping closer until her chest brushed against his trench coat. "If you ever ignore me again, Kong Ji-hoon, I won't resign. I will just shoot you myself." A genuine, breathtaking smile broke across Ji-hoon's face, the first time anyone in the syndicate had ever seen him smile. He holstered his weapon, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her flush against him. "I would expect nothing less from my queen." He kissed her, right there in the middle of the ruined garden, surrounded by 100 armed men. It wasn't a soft, romantic kiss. It was desperate, bruising, and deeply territorial, a violent sealing of a new contract. 6 months later, the landscape of Seoul had irrevocably changed. The Kong Syndicate's boardroom was no longer a freezing mausoleum. It hummed with terrifying efficiency. At the head of the massive mahogany table sat 2 leather chairs, perfectly equal in size. Kong Ji-hoon sat on the left, reviewing the latest acquisition reports. Min Ah-young sat on the right, a massive diamond catching the light on her left hand as she flawlessly executed a hostile takeover of a rival tech firm. The men in the room no longer looked just to the chairman, they deferred equally to the architect. Tao had retreated to the north, licking his wounds and securing his borders, knowing better than to challenge the combined force of the 2 deadliest minds in the country. Ji-hoon paused his reading, glancing over at Ah-young. She looked up, catching his eye. There was no coldness left between them. Only the mutual, burning respect of two rulers who had finally found their equal. The king had his crown, but it was the queen who held the keys to the kingdom.